compelling is the fact that games have become social, and the fact that games are now have a business model that allows everybody to try games much more than before. So for those of you who are not gamers and not familiar, that means that before you would go to a store, would buy a game, the cost would be anything between $20 and $60, depending on the platform and the complexity of the game and so on. Would go home, unwrap it, put it in a console, which more or less would look like a DVD player, play for a while, usually 20 to 40 hours of gameplay, so not a bad deal when you do the math. Today, you can download a game on your iPhone or your iPad, whether it's an iPad mini or a full iPad, for nothing. So fundamentally, the majority of games, about 75 to 80% of the games that you find in the App Store today are so-called free-to-play. Now you understand that, consider the typical gamer who's, by the way, older than the, let's say, the common place usually has it. It's usually 35-year-old male. Disposable income, you still can probably buy, let's say, 4 to 6 games a year, let's say 8. Today you can try a new game every day. So the amount of gaming experience and the amount of gameplay skills that we are teaching to people is a lot larger than it was before. We reach more people, we reach them more often, we reach them on a basis which is really democratic, I would say, because we don't ask for money. You can play our game, if you like it, then you can monetize, we monetize them through downloading content which is for pay. The other disruptive factor, obviously, is the social component. Before the marketing would take place by, for example, the usual marketing channels. It would be print, it would be television, it would be billboards, it would be in movie theaters and advertising and so on. Today, word of mouth counts for much more than not any form of traditional marketing that you see. Not that traditional market has lost its importance, but it's become one of the many factors that a game maker has to consider when trying to market a game. And marketing a viral phenomenon is always a lot more complex because you don't have a direct line of sight on the elements that really modify. In terms of, very briefly, the things that usually people think as extremely challenging to make a game, and where people usually tend to think as the innovation of gaming is whether it's graphics, whether it's sound and so on. We're actually not seeing a major wave of innovation. The games that you see today on an iPhone or on an iPad are fundamentally the same level of sophistication that you find on Xbox. And consoles at this point have started to plateau as far as innovation in that sense. So I would say the things to watch are really the new business models, free-to-play above all, and really the fact that you have the social components playing such an integral factor.
Jefferson, you work at Electronic Arts. When we were working together there, I think it was the largest, the leading video game company in the world. It has seen a lot of transformation in 5 years. So maybe from that point of view, can you share your experience on it?
Yeah, so EA for a long time was the biggest games company in the world. I mean, it's a little over 30 years old company, and now it's like number 2, I guess. But it always there's a lot of threats from every side, in the space where it used to be very few companies that had the capital and the ability to get there. I think you touched on a lot of really good things from if you look from a consumer and the market perspective. I think from a business, if you're in the game making business, probably the biggest change that has happened recently is, and EA has had to go through that, is the games business used to be a B2B business. So EA never sold games to consumers. We sold games to Walmart. So all of our marketing, all of our distribution, everything we had was gauged to those guys. Whereas now we actually sell games directly to consumers. I mean, there's Apple a little bit in the middle, but it really, we have to, change the way we used to market and talk to people in a more direct conversation. And it's the same for the game makers. In the past, you used to make a game for 20 hours of game. It needs to look good. I mean, really, as a developer, your job was to make a game that looked good, so marketing could take screenshots, put in the back of the box, and then people would pay $60 for it because they believed it would be good enough. Whereas today, as a game maker, you actually have to, because the games are free, you actually have to make a game so good that people feel compelled to spend, like the money which they really could be using anywhere. They could be going to the movies, or they could be having a coffee in the corner. So like but you gotta make sure that they enjoy that so much that they actually give you their money. So I think those are for people who have been around for EA, like those are the biggest changes, like having to change the mindset of actually focusing a lot more on the consumer than used to be in the past.
Eric, from a little more external point of view on this.
So I think I have maybe quite a bit different perspective, mostly because the bulk of we do board games and video games, but the bulk of our business and the bulk of our revenue is on the cardboard side. So I guess the way we solve the disruption issues is by doing cardboard board games. Cardboard games, or traditional board games, have been the same forever. And the thing that attracted me to that industry is the best-selling title in board games is a game that was the #1 bestseller in 1935. That's Monopoly. Okay? And so if you can have a business that stays the same through all kind of platforms coming up and then going away for 80 years, that's probably a pretty interesting business, even if it's not a very visible one. So that's one thing that for us is very different, is the time perspective that we have is quite different. And that's fun because we also do video games, and when we talk to the Microsofts and Sonys of the world about distributing our games and doing games for the platforms, they're like, okay, you must do this version on the Xbox One. And the real honest answer is, no, we don't need to. We might, and if we don't, one of two things will happen. That platform will become really, really successful, and eventually we might port our game there, or it might fail and disappear, in which case we didn't lose anything by not doing anything on it. So I think that having a different time scale gives us a bit different perspective. And then the other thing that is quite different is we sell two types of games. We sell board games, which typically we sell for $50, and that's a big box of cardboard that you buy, and you pay $50, and then you go home and you play it. Or you buy video games on your iPhone, on the iPad, and you pay from $1 to $7 or $10 for what we sell. And what we found out is it's a lot easier to sell a $50 cardboard game than it is to sell a game that you want to give away. Okay? And I think the reason for that is the more we go into a digital world, the more people get to value the tangible physical aspect and the experience that you can get out of the real world. Okay? And you're seeing this not just in the game industry, I think the same also in the music industry. If you look at the sales of vinyls, for instance, the sales of vinyl has actually been rising steadily for the last 10 years. Now, granted, it's never back to the level that it was 30 years ago, but if you're the only guy making vinyl in town, it's pretty good business. And that's kind of our view of the gaming space, is we tend to stay on the cardboard side. We only use the video stuff as a way to teach people how to play the game, but I really believe it's easier to sell a luxury good for $50 than something that you can try for a day for free.
So the next point is so I believe that we're still, well, the interesting thing that has been happening in the industry is that it kind of grew larger, even though there was a lot of disruption, and there was a lot of change in the distribution channels, and we see, we hear, what was it, like Call of Duty Ghost from Activision. The first day sold for $1 billion. The first day, one day of sales sold for $1 billion. So that's really the male 35 disposable income audience that you're talking. Well, only that really kind of niche audience, can generate that kind of demand for a product, which is kind of fantastic. I mean, I don't hear a lot of movies generating $1 billion the first day they go out. Then on the other side, on the mobile platform, we know that a game like Candy Crush Saga or the Supercell games, they can generate easily something like, what is it, $1 million to $2 million per day? But that's over a period of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and even more than that. So the industry got really, really, really big, and I'd like to hear from you. Just to give an idea of for the audience, of what does it mean economically, that gaming industry, in terms of how many people it employs, and just general value of this industry. It's just not for kids anymore.
Well, I would say the major challenge at this point is that in terms of doing some accounting along the lines that you described, is that there is a lot of small companies that are making a lot of money. There are no public companies. Before, when you looked at the top 20 publishers in the world, probably 18 of them were public companies. So they had obviously an obligation to publish their numbers. Now you have you mentioned too, you mentioned Supercell out of Finland, which is a private company. We do know a little bit about their business because they've actually been in the press a lot today. I think that probably some of the numbers are inflated, but definitely because, funnily enough, it's going back to being a cottage industry in a way, right? The two guys in a garage can still make a game and make a hit. It's difficult to account for that, but one thing that we know for sure, the number of companies in the sector is increasing. I don't know, my guess would be probably 100-fold just in the last 3-4 years. The revenues, I've read the numbers lately that put the number around $40 billion of worldwide revenues, accounting for everything. That includes, obviously, physical goods, like, for example, some of the peripherals, not the iPad and the iPhone itself, but, for example, some of the additional hardware that you might buy or accessory that you might buy. The Xbox itself, controllers, so it's a very large industry. When we think about video games, we cannot think only about the bits that we play that are the digital content. There is a lot of physical content that goes with it. So it's definitely an exploding industry, but I think the thing that is the most impressive, I go back to not necessarily the numbers per se, because I don't think that in that sense we have matured enough to be able to do a proper accounting of what the potential from an economical standpoint is. But if you look at the number of people that actually play games, so you mentioned, for example, Supercell, Clash of Clans, making about $1 million a day. Consider this. Of the number of players that actually play that game, the number of people who actually spend any money is about 5 to 6%. So some of these people might be spending more than $1 a day, but if you do the math, the number of people that actually download, play the game for more than a day, it's very, very large. So for the first time, we are seeing not only the traditional gamer, moms are playing games, kids are playing games, families are playing games. A friend of mine used to say that one day we'll have a president of the United States who's a gamer. I think it probably we already do. Actually, I do know that Obama's children do play games. So we are in a situation in which games are not necessarily just affecting the bottom line of a few companies, are creating such a large, casting such a large shadow that invest in films. We're seeing films being derived from games. Obviously, games that come from films have been done for a very long time. So the real impact is not necessarily just in terms of hard dollars, but in terms of the potential that the industry has to generate the revenues and impact a very large section of the economy in the future.
Jefferson,
Yeah, it's interesting because like in the past, the industry used to be very concentrated in a few places like UK and US, and those are the only places where I could like work in games. Like I said in the beginning, I was from Brazil, and I had to start my own company to get into the space because there was no like jobs around. I was working games. I just had to start it like my own company at the time. Whereas now there's like several game developers in Brazil, and so I think that got a little bit more broad because of these platforms where you really have the potential to reach like players all over the world, like from wherever you are, and it can be a single person that can make a game. Obviously, the other side of the coin is there's a lot of people trying, and only very few people succeed. So like a lot of people don't talk about that side. Like it's not a super safe business. So like if you're planning to put all your money into it, like think twice, 3 times. It's a very hit-driven, so like it's a winner-take-all. Like particularly on a console basis now, you see like Activision coming out and making $1 billion in a day. That means everybody else who came out yesterday made absolutely nothing. So it's a pretty like tough business that way. On the digital platforms, a little less so, and I actually know a lot of people who have a small company and they're very profitable and they make enough money to keep doing it and they're happy about it. But it's not like a high growth business which usually you associate with public companies, right? The growth needs to be there. So I like the fact that today there's just more ways you can make games, which also means there are more games, more different types of games to play. Because in the past, like, you could only make a game which was like super safe because it costs like 15 million to make, so you're not going to make something crazy. Whereas now, like, the costs are lower. It's more people who you can, share your game with. So I think there's more, there's more types of game being made and different things being successful, which is, I think, is great for everybody, at least as players.
And I think again, maybe I have a little bit different perspective, looking at it from the cardboard angle. So we make digital versions of our games. We have a game, Ticket Ride, that on the iPad has been for the last 2.5 years now, in the top 100 to top 200 grossing games on the iPad. So that means that there's only at most 200 games that are making more revenue per day than Ticket Ride. And I'll be very frank, if that was our only business, that'd be a pretty mediocre, possibly shitty business to be in. Okay, because if you're number 200 right now, you're making less than $1 million a year. So if you're a single developer in your home and you're making $500,000-$600,000, okay, that's not bad. You just need to keep in mind that that's not going to last very long because the platform is going to change. If you're a real company and you're making $1 million or $2 million a year, that's not such a great business. Now, granted, in the 199 top grossing games that are ahead of you, the number one is making $3.5 million a day right now. But again, there's two things to keep in mind. One is they're making $3.5 million a day, but only as long as they're number one. And the minute they fall to number two, they're only making $1 million a day. Now you can say, well, $1 million a day is great. Now, you drop to number 10, and you'll be lucky if you're making $50 million a year. You drop to number 50, you'll be lucky if you're making $10 million a year. Now, $10 million a year might sound like a lot of money, but there's lots of real-world businesses out there that make a lot more than that, and doesn't mean they're very profitable. And I think the other thing that is that I would advise people to be careful about when they look at the mobile space in particular, with the explosion of free-to-play games, where on the iPad, especially 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, there was maybe 15% of the top 100 grossing games that were free-to-play games. And nowadays, if you look last week, for instance, it was like 92% of the top 100 games were free-to-play games. Is the top grossing or the revenue you make doesn't tell the whole story. Because what you should really care about if you're running a business is how much you have after you back out the expenses. And those free-to-play games has this curious concept where they do spend a lot on customer acquisition. Now, being a guy that sells cardboard games, I have a different view. For me, a customer is someone that pays me, not someone that I spend money to acquire. But so if you look at the top 200 grossing games, a lot of them, not the number one, not the number two, so super